A warm welcome to this Klimatdialog event with the European Commission's Executive Vice President, Frans Timmermans. My name is Katarina Rolfsdotter Jansson, and I am honored to be hosting this event that is put in place by the European Commission's Swedish representation. I am a chair of the think tank Global Utmaning, and I'm also the program host of We Don't Have Time, who is broadcasting this event, as is the European Commission. Those of you present here at Norra Latin can ask questions to Frans Timmermans by raising your hand, and a hand microphone will be handed to you. And those of you following the event online, please write your questions on the platform you are following the event from. But today the focus is very much on youth, because this is the European Year of the Youth. And we have special guests here today. We have students from 7 schools. We have 180 students from 7 schools here present at Norra Latin. Most of the schools are from Stockholm. We have one from the region of Jämtland. So I'll read out the names of the schools, and you can wave if you'd like, those of you present here from your schools. We have students from Kungstens gymnasiet. Don't be shy. Norra Real. Great, here you go. And also Rålambshovsskolan. Terrific. Solna gymnasium. Hej, hej. Enskilda gymnasiet. Kumla skola. Och Fjällgymnasiet från Stenstavik i Jämtland. Warm welcome, especially a warm welcome to you students. And Frans Timmermans is on his way. But we'd like to warm up with a video that is especially made for you students. It's about what kind of Europe we can create, we the people can create. A greener, a fairer, and a more digital Europe. So let's draw this video, and it clearly states that we need you, the next generation, to make this happen. Let's roll the video.
Morning. Hi.
Please take a seat.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Wonderful to have you with us here in Stockholm, Frans Timmermans.
Great to be here.
I know you had a very busy visit to Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
You've been up to Luleå in the north, checking out the hybrid project that aims to create fossil-free steel. And you've visited with the Stockholm Ecocide project here in Stockholm. And today you visited with the Swedish Parliament and met with our Prime Minister, Magdalena Andersson.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to start out with a question before we turn to the students here. Could you share your insights about what you have experienced in Sweden, and also a bit about what you see Sweden's role as a big player, or a good player, a valid player in this transition to a climate-neutral Europe?
Sweden, from the very start, of course, has been a very strong supporter of the Green Deal, and has shown the way to many other nations in terms of their energy mix, in terms of what you can do as individual citizens in society, in terms of getting everybody along in this transition. So Sweden has a huge role to play in showing that experience to others. And now Sweden is also playing an incredible role in confronting the biggest challenge we have, which is the Putin's war against Ukraine. And also here, you know, these two colors we share, which is yellow and blue, we share it, Sweden, Ukraine, and the European Union. They stand for something very profound. And the Green Deal the energy transition, the climate policy, they are all based on our fundamental values. And these fundamental values are attacked today by Putin. So we have a chance of a lifetime to defend what we believe in, but we need to do it, and we need to mobilize all our resources. Because every conflict, almost every conflict we see on the planet today is linked to the climate crisis. So confronting the climate crisis is also contributing to our security. And Sweden understands this. So Sweden can really help us convince others to see it the same way.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you to say a few words about the EU climate targets, because maybe not everybody is completely up to date about the climate goals.
So what we want to do is to be the first climate neutral continent on Earth in 2050. To get there, because many countries on the planet are now saying they want that, but that is only credible if you have a plan. And that plan needs to take you to a massive reduction of your emissions by 2030. So what we've done is to put into law in Europe that the EU has to reduce its emissions with at least 55% by 2030. That would take us on a realistic trajectory to climate neutrality by 2050. And I've put on the table a set of measures, draft laws, for the member states to decide, for the European Parliament to decide, so that we can actually make this reduction happen in actual fact between now and 2030, and that we can show the way to 2050.
Could you share some examples on how this can really be put in place?
Well, and this has been even made more urgent by the war. We need to speed up our energy transition. We need to make sure that the energy we need, and that's a lot of energy, will be renewable energy more than anything else. So we need to build more offshore wind parks. We need to put solar panels on every single roof in Europe. That would really change things. And that would greatly reduce our emissions, but it would also reduce the energy bills so many Europeans are suffering to pay these days. And it would mean that we would put the money into Europe and not into Putin's pockets. So we have this very urgent need to speed up our energy transition. So I was talking about offshore wind, I was talking about solar. We need to increase massively biogas production as well, and Sweden can lead the way on that as well. But we also need to reduce our energy consumption. You know, if all Europeans who can do it would reduce the temperature in their homes with 1 degree, we would save 10 billion cubic meters of gas. That would be less gas bought in Russia. And these are the things we can do. Every single one of us can do that. Take a bike a bit more often rather than the car. Take public transport instead of driving yourself. Be more conscious in the choices you make. Shower perhaps 1 minute less or a little bit colder. All these things that people say, well, these are small things. Yes, but if we do them all together, this has a huge effect on our energy consumption, and we need to bring that energy consumption down. It's good for the planet, and it's good for our resilience against Russian aggression.
So maybe you need to put a sweater on for as a solidarity act to Ukraine.
Well, I mean, you know, it's easy to ridicule these things, but they are of essential importance. And you know, people often ask me, yes, okay, climate crisis, but what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, this is what you can do. And if we all do that, we really make a difference. Just changing a bit our lifestyle has an enormously positive effect on the climate crisis.
Indeed. When I listened to you at COP26 in Glasgow, and you showed an image of your grandchild in the phone during the final stages of the negotiations, I said to myself, this will have an impact, because this will make it possible for the world leaders to connect their hearts with their brains. And today we have in the audience here the next generation, and especially invited students. And I know you very much, you're involved in the future of and their well-being. So I'd like now to turn to the students. And we have questions prepared, and now we have more light in the audience. And I'd like to start with turning to Amelie in Kungstens gymnasiet. So Amelie, would you please stand up and you will have a hand microphone handed to you, so you can ask your question to Frans Timmermans.
Yes, thank you. So my question is, how does the EU work to reach the climate goals, and do you think we will succeed? Also, how can we increase the knowledge in society about the climate goals, and what can the individual do to reach these goals? Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to start by saying failure is just not an option, because failure means that we will be losing your futures. It's as simple as that. And if we fail in the next 8 years, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to catch up and correct. And I feel this almost on a daily basis. I feel this so strongly that if my generation fails you, we will have colonized your future. We will have eaten up, almost literally, your future. And so we can no longer afford to do that. So in my view, failure is not an option, but it will be failure if we don't mobilize. And so we need to mobilize the public. And the one thing, I could talk for hours about this, but I want to concentrate on one point which I believe is going to be crucial in the years to come. I predict there's going to be a mobilization against climate policy, like there was from certain political quarters a mobilization against LGBTI rights, or a mobilization against an open society, or a mobilization against diversity. The next frontier will be climate policy. So we should mobilize ourselves against that threat. And what will be the argument that they will use? They will say, this is for rich people. Poor people can't afford this. This will create divisions in society. So I think if we want to be successful, we need to understand that the climate crisis is the new social question. Like in the previous first industrial revolution in the 19th century, it took us too long to understand that we needed to do something about social deprivation of the workers in the new industry. Now we need to understand that we need to avoid social deprivation of those who could be victims of the transition to a sustainable society. So it is about social policy. It is about creating social funds to compensate people who are at risk of energy poverty. It is about helping people to, the irony is, the horrible reality is that the people who spend relatively most on energy are also the poorest people, because they live in the worst houses. They live in drafty houses where you use much more energy. And people like myself and other people who have high incomes, even with high energy prices, we say, oh my God, it's high. But it doesn't really hurt us. But if you're living on the edge, higher energy bills means you can't buy food or other things. So unless we all understand that the climate crisis is also a social crisis, and that without addressing the social element, without rethinking redistribution in society, we will fail. So this is my very concrete answer to your question. Let's also see this issue in terms of redistribution. We have a limited space on this planet. We need to make sure that everybody has a spot in that limited place. And within that, we have to make sure we have a fair redistribution of the means within societies and between societies. If this can be portrayed as unfair, our citizens will stop it. Because we should never assume that because something is life-threatening, it will never happen because people are smart enough. If people believe, if you don't know how to make the end of the month, the end of the planet is not your first concern, frankly. So we need to make sure that people feel part of this and that we leave no one behind.
Thank you very much for this passionate statement and answer to Emily's question. Let's now turn to Victoria at Rålambshovsskolan. You can ask your question, please.
My question is, how do you think the war in Ukraine will affect the readjustment to a fossil-free society?
Thank you, Victoria.
Well, Victoria, that's I think one of the most important questions we need to answer today, and we should not avoid answering that question. What helps me and the Green Deal is the fact that no one in Europe now disputes that we need to move faster to generating our own energy, that we need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels coming from elsewhere, and especially from Russia. Now, since we don't have our own fossil fuels, or very limited, no oil, a bit of gas, coal, but there's no future in coal, how is Europe going to increase its own resilience in the energy sector? That is mainly through renewables. Offshore wind, rooftop solar, biogas, geothermal, hydro, all these things that will generate the energy we will need, and we will need more energy, by ourselves in a sustainable way. Some would add to that nuclear. I respect that, but just do the numbers. Make sure you don't, you spend your limited funds in the right way to get as much renewable energy as possible, would be my advice. But we will wean ourselves of the dependence of Russian energy very quickly, and we can only do that if we speed up the energy transition. Now, the energy transition is a core element in the European Green Deal and Fit for 55. You cannot dissociate the energy transition from the other things we need, such as also reducing our energy consumption, as we were saying before, moving to electric mobility, moving to solar panels and heat pumps for housing. All these things are an integrated approach. So I believe in that sense, if we want to have a structural answer to the security challenge Russia is today, and sadly will be for a long time, frankly, we need to make more of our own energy. Of course, we need to import energy from elsewhere, but we need to do it in such a way, in such a diversified way, that we do not depend on single providers of that energy. And we need to create a new energy source, which is green hydrogen. And the green hydrogen economy will be a global green hydrogen economy with many stakeholders in Africa, in the Middle East, in Australia, in Asia, in Latin America, in North America. And Europe needs to lead the way. We have the best technology. We are more advanced than others. This is going to be an essential element in the Green Deal. So my answer to your question is, this could accelerate the Green Deal. Of course, there are opponents of the Green Deal who are saying, well, the Green Deal is luxury. We can come back to that once this crisis is over. But the same people said the same thing when the pandemic started. And then we understood that the Green Deal is also an answer to the challenges the pandemic posed. And likewise, the Green Deal can also be part of the answer. Of course, security policy will come into it. I'm not naive. But the Green Deal can also be part of the answer to increase our European resilience and to be stronger vis-à-vis people who threaten our values and who threaten, frankly, our borders.
Thank you. Let's now turn to Tilde from Kumla skola. And all the students present here are EU ambassadors in their schools, as it's important to note. So Tilde, please stand up. Kumla skola. There's a microphone coming your way.
The Green Deal is a way in the right direction. Do you think that European Union can lead the way for other countries, and if so, how?
Thank you.
Thank you, Tilde, for this question. What I saw in Glasgow, the COP26, before, there was a lot of skepticism, will we be able to do this? But now, large parts of the planet have committed to carbon or climate neutrality by the middle of the century, 2050, some 2060. But only very few in the planet have mapped out exactly how to get there. In that sense, Europe is quite unique. Nobody else has done that exercise in such detail as we have. So this is now an example that others are studying very carefully, and others are also trying to follow. And we should use that experience and use that preparation to share as much as possible with others who also want to go in that way, so that we can help them make this transition. I can give you a couple of concrete examples. There are a number of countries, 3 I want to mention, where we are trying to establish sort of a model they could use in their energy transition. First is South Africa. We've brought together a coalition of EU countries, plus the United Kingdom, plus the United States, plus international organizations plus institutional banks to finance the way out of coal for South Africa, because South Africa is highly dependent on coal and has a very, very deeply indebted energy sector. We've already brought together 8 billion euros to move in that direction. Private investors then become more interested in investing because, you know, there's always sun and always wind in South Africa. So they have an incredible potential resource of solar and wind for their energy needs. But they are stuck in a coal-based economy, and we need to help them with our ideas to make a just energy transition. Future for the coal miners, you know, they need to find jobs elsewhere, etc., etc. We are now developing comparable plans with Vietnam that also wants to exit out of coal and look for especially offshore wind, but also solar as an alternative. But it's difficult to organize. You need to change your grid, etc., etc. We want to be in an international coalition, part of that transition. Same goes to Indonesia. And more countries are interested to follow that model. So that is also a way of using our experience to help others to go down the same path. Having said all that, I have to be honest with you, it's going to be very, very difficult because it is easy to commit to a long-term goal. It is much more difficult to take the concrete steps to get there. And if you don't take the steps now, the goal will remain pie in the sky. You will never get there. So it is our interest to help others also formulate concrete policies to get there.
Thank you for your answer. Let's now turn to Mohammed and Yasin from Solna Gymnasium. And just a note while the microphone is handed to you, we have viewers watching this broadcast, and don't get nervous now, Mohammed, from 103 countries.
I'm Yasin, I'm not Mohammed. But
yeah, sorry, Yasin.
Yeah. How does EU support the development of green airlines and electrification, question mark?
Of green, sorry?
Airlines.
Ah, green airlines. Well, yesterday I was made aware of something that is now being developed in Sweden, just to give you an example. But I'll start at the other end. Aviation will remain essential. You know, look at a country like Sweden. You cannot eliminate aviation if you need to cover these huge distances, especially from peripheral areas. So what we need to eliminate is short-haul flights. That can be done, especially in the densely populated parts of Europe. There are still, I think, 3 to 5 flights daily between Brussels and Amsterdam, and there's also high-speed train link. It doesn't make sense. So these are the things we need to do quickly. In aviation, electrifying aviation is not going to be easy. Yes, there are some very promising small-scale projects, but the idea that you could have, you know, big airliners crossing the Atlantic on batteries is very, very unlikely. So what we can do is to make sure the fuels that are used in aviation are sustainable fuels, biofuels. I think that is the best step we can take now. And that brings me to one of the ideas I heard here in Sweden yesterday, which I find fascinating. You know that biomass is being put in furnaces to create heat and energy here. Now, that biomass is in our legislation considered to be carbon neutral, but of course it does emit CO2 when you burn it. So if you then capture that CO2, which is now a Swedish project, in those furnaces, you can turn that CO2 into sustainable aviation fuel. And these are the kinds of ideas that are popping up all over the world and all over Europe that will help us. The airlines are complaining to me. They say, we want to do this, but it's excruciatingly expensive today, and we can't get our hands on enough of this fuel. So we need to help them by quickly increasing the production of biofuels, to do that as quickly as possible, and also help the development of engines and transport modes that could function more rationally, a lot better with these fuels. This is what we need to do, I think, for the airline industry. And then, of course, I still maintain more trains, less planes, for the short distances. We really need to revolutionize our transport modes. You know that Europe became Europe because the train was invented. There's a brilliant scholar who's written about the 19th century, and he said once the trains connections were established in Europe, Europeans started to discover each other and each other culture. This has a huge positive impact on understanding between Europeans. It also had the negative impact that you could kill Europeans much more quickly because you could get them to the front line quickly, but that's left aside. But I believe this European heritage with trains, we should rediscover that. We should rediscover the beauty of traveling in Europe by train, but we should also make it easier. Easier ticketing, lower prices, modular transport so that it's interlinked with all other forms of transport. And you young people, do as I did, because when I was your age, it was much too expensive to fly. So I traveled around Europe, well, hitchhiking or with trains. And to know other European countries, a train is a wonderful instrument. So please take the train.
I see questions coming in from the viewers, and there are a few questions on subsidies connected to aviation, for instance, so maybe we have an option to get back to that. Let's now turn to Johan from Fjällgymnasiet. Could you please stand up, Johan? Here you go.
Thank you. My school lives in a very rural area of Sweden, where the public transports are deficient. There's long distances and often no buses. A lot of people depend on the car to, for example, get to work or go to the store. High petrol and diesel prices hit us with low incomes hard. What do you think about the high petrol prices?
Well, first of all, I believe that we need to reduce our dependency on petrol, and what we can do from the European Union is use the investments we will need to quickly enlarge the electric charging infrastructure in rural areas. Because in many city and populated areas, it's business that will pay for it, because it's a no-brainer. It's a good business to put fast chargers everywhere, but not so much in rural areas. So there I think we should step in from the European level and the national level to make sure that there is a charger at least every 60 kilometers, so that electric mobility becomes more attractive. Now, you will say immediately, yes, but these electric cars are more expensive than certainly second-hand combustion engine cars. So we need to do a couple of other things. First of all, electric cars are already a lot cheaper to drive today, and high energy prices will make that proposition more attractive, especially if at home you have solar panels and you can charge your car almost for free with your own solar panels. But there are also other ways of making it cheaper, the charging. So that's already the case. But the car is still expensive. Bloomberg has calculated that within 5 to 6 years, electric cars will also be cheaper to buy than combustion engine cars. Then you will say to me, but that doesn't solve our problems because we have second-hand cars. So what we need to do is devise a policy that drives out the dirtiest, polluting second-hand cars fastest, and that we also remain with the cleaner second-hand cars as soon as possible, fuel-efficient, hybrid, and that we do that as well. That is my answer to your question. My answer is not you should be taking the bus or you should just stick where you are. Too many Europeans just depend on their own mobility solution, especially in rural areas. And we shouldn't punish them for that. We should make it easier for them to do that. And we should also make it easier for them to transit to less polluting transport modes and to electric vehicles at some point. And I think, if when I propose for the first time that we should stop selling combustion engine cars on the European market in 2035, there was a huge outcry by the automotive industry. Impossible, you're crazy, we can't do it. And 2 years later, it's the norm. It's the norm. So we can do much more and much faster than we had thought before. So that would be my answer. But at the same time, I would also urge national authorities, together with us or individually, to also look at their public transport systems, because they, in many places, could be improved also by making them more tailor-made. So buses on demand, an app you can use if you need transport, etc. These are really exciting developments. And one final remark, hopefully that will appeal to the younger people here. We also need to rethink the way we see cars. You know, for my grandparents, a car was unattainable. My grandfathers were coal miners. You could never afford a car. So for my dad, being able to buy a car was a measure of his success in life. So the car was a symbol that he was successful. And I have to admit, I still have a bit of that. You know, that's how I was brought up. But if I look at my own kids, the two oldest ones are in their early 30s now, for them a car is just a thing they need. And they can do without as long as they get decent transport. So I think we will need to look at transport no longer as something you need to own, but a service that can be provided. And car manufacturers need to rethink their business models and need to think in terms of service they provide. And if you still want to have a car, then probably I think your generation will not buy cars, but lease cars. Because like with mobile phones, cars develop now so fast that your car is outdated or outmoded in battery technology or other technology in 2-3 years. And if you then have bought it, you're stuck with it. But if you lease a car, you can get the new model, etc., etc. But the main thing is, in the future, and that's part of our circular economy, we should not be buying cars, we should be buying the service of transport. We should not be buying phones, we should be buying the service of communication, etc., etc., etc. in other areas. That is how you can develop a circular economy.
Thank you. Let's now turn to Märta from Enskilda gymnasiet.
According to the Geneva Convention, people fleeing due to climate change are not considered refugees and therefore do not have the same rights as people fleeing from political conflicts or war. Do you believe that the international laws regarding climate migrants have to change? If they won't, how will climate migrants be treated in the future?
Well, you know, I think we indeed need to change international conventions. I think it's a recent CIPRI study. I quote it from memory, so don't pin me down on it. CIPRI has analyzed global conflicts and came to the conclusion that a majority of global conflicts are linked to climate crisis issues. And we should come to a better understanding of the fact that the climate crisis is first and foremost also a security crisis. Because parts of the planet will become unlivable because temperatures are too high. Parts of the planet will become unlivable because there's no more water. Parts of the planet will become unlivable because harvests will no longer be able to be collected. Parts of the planet will become unlivable because there's too much water. And all of that, human history is a testimony to that. Along millennia of human history, when the climate changes, when you can no longer find animals to feed you or harvests, you migrate. You know, European history for 5,000 years is determined by migration from the east to the west. And they only started migrating if it was no longer livable where they are. And that is exactly what is now happening, but on steroids with the climate crisis worldwide. And as long as we don't see that, we will be faced with migration crises because we have not helped the countries of origin to adapt to the climate crisis and to mitigate the consequences. So if we change our perspective and we understand that tackling the climate crisis in Africa and other places is a direct contribution to our security and not only to the livelihoods of people there, normally that should be moral and imperative enough to do it for the other people. But if you're not convinced by that, do it for yourselves, because if we don't do it, we will have migratory flows of unprecedented scale because people will no longer be able to live where they are now. So in that sense, the migration should be addressed in a far more comprehensive way, including the climate crisis as a justification for the giving of asylum to people who flee from that. Because the climate crisis will lead to violent conflict, almost without any doubt.
And the numbers are staggering when we estimate the amount of, we're talking about maybe 200 million climate refugees.
Yes. Yes.
We have a question from Gunnar at Norra Real.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for coming here. I would like to ask the question of how does the European Union, or does the European Union intend on further curtailing international oil and gas giants, and how does it intend on going about doing that?
Well, I think this, Gunnar, this is a question that usually appeals to me, because if you look, you know, people are always saying, oh my God, we need 300 billion a year to invest in the transition, and that's so much money, etc., etc. I think the IMF has calculated that that there's more than 1 million per second or something like that that is invested in fossil fuel exploration. So there's still so much money going into the fossil fuel industry. Private money, but also through subsidies or tax relief, public money. And I think we need to have a very close look at this. Now, I'm not naive. Transiting away from fossil fuels into other fuels, into renewable fuels, is not very easy. It is a complicated matter, because there is an incredible global balance between supply and demand and transportation. And you see that a war like now in Ukraine has created huge problems in all these sectors. So it creates a lot of anxiety in societies that there would not be enough fuel, that you know, we would not be able to drive our cars or heat our homes, etc., or have our industry produce. So this is a very sensitive and emotional issue. But if we do not confront the fact that more investment needs to go in renewables and much less into fossil fuels, then we will lose the plot. We will lose the plot, and we will not get the transition done as quickly as we need to do. And the first thing that could be envisaged is to redirect some of that investment into renewables. And you know, some of the major producers of fossil fuel, they understand that there's going to be a moment where we no longer use fossil fuels, and they're thinking, so what are our strengths? It's not just getting it out of the ground, it's also getting it to the customer. So we still will need to get energy to the customer, even if we don't take it out of the ground anymore. So could we not be champions in getting green hydrogen to the customer, or in doing other renewable things and getting it to the customer? Those energy companies who think along those lines, they have a future. Those who say there is clean coal, there is clean oil, which is all nonsense, they don't have a future, and we should deprive them of all this investment. Now, the good development, and I'll end on that, the good development is that the big institutional investors, the big funds, you know, BlackRock and all this, talking about tens of billions of dollars and euros a year, they have changed course. They understand they need to move towards renewables. Let's help them do that, and let's push as much as we can investment in the traditional energy sector towards renewables, also within the energy sector.
Thank you very much, students, for your questions. I know you have more, and let's see if we can turn back to you again after having checked in with the audience that are watching online, and also, of course, other people here in the audience that would like to ask questions. So let's now look at the questions that have been coming in from the We Don't Have Time platform. We have one about fossil subsidies. The International Monetary Fund says the world spends nearly $6 trillion a year directly and indirectly supporting fossil fuels and their damage. And during the COP26, we had a counter on our stage, counting up.
Yes.
You might have seen it, how many trillions of dollars that were pumping, billions were pumped out during the COP, which was very disturbing for all the speakers we had on stage because it was really counterproductive. According to the conference on the future of Europe in 2021, the EU spends twice as much directly subsidizing fossil fuels versus renewable energies. It's a worldwide problem for sure, but when, here comes the question, when will the EU show leadership and end this absurdity and use the money saved to, for example, targeting those in fuel poverty with fuel security, such as energy efficiency, heat pumps, and clean energy?
Mm-hmm. We're in the middle of this transition right now. And one of the elements why energy prices are higher, apart from the conflict, apart from Putin's war, apart from incredible demand after the pandemic, is also because everybody understands we're slowly putting an end to a system that was in place for 200 years. And we need to have that perspective. The whole economy, our whole society, this building, everything was built on carbon. It started with coal, then it went into oil, then it went into gas. So everything we've been doing, all our industrial setup, all our societal setup, all our social programs, education program, healthcare, is based on carbon. And now we need to wean ourselves of that carbon to a large extent so that we can survive. This is such a fundamental transformation that redirecting all this investment overnight is almost impossible. But we need to take the steps. Now, let me give you, from the European perspective, just to be very concrete. In a country like Poland, we still have coal mines operating. And the people living in those regions are very worried about their future. Now, to keep that going, because they are no longer competitive, to keep that going, yearly, the Polish government has to put enormous amounts of subsidies into that sector. Just imagine, with European help, we could come up with a plan and enough money to transit from that digging up coal to another form of industry, whether it's battery making or whether it's electric bus, because Poland is already the biggest exporter of electric buses in Europe. In the renewable area, it's entirely possible. And then you would have, also with the Polish money, enormous funds to make that happen. But the paralysis comes from the fact that people don't really trust that. So they'd rather hang on to what they have than take a leap of faith into the future. So the leap seems huge. So what we need to do as Europeans, in answer to that question, is to make that leap narrower, to make it less of a scary thing to do. And for that we need funds. And so I can understand when people in my country or in Sweden say, why should we contribute to the just transition of countries that have failed to get out of coal in the past? Why should we be part of that? Well, because if we don't help them, they will not do it, and then we will not attain our climate goals. And if we help them, they will do it, and they will contribute also to the competitiveness of Europe with modern industries. We need to do it now because we are in a good demographic situation. I'm from a coal mining region. We had to exit out of coal 50 years ago. My hometown was always among the 3 richest towns in the Netherlands. Since 50 years, we're always amongst the 3 poorest towns in the Netherlands because we didn't do the transition right. Now we have also because we had an energy crisis and we had mass unemployment. Now there is no need for unemployment. We need every single European to be skilled to do the jobs we have. So we have a unique opportunity. And if we fail the people in the coal mining industry today, we can never fix it again. So we need to have the sense of urgency to make this transition happen now. So the answer to the question is money on the table for the transition. It's a good investment and it will be paid back through the taxes these people will be paying out of the salaries that will be increased working in a new industry.
There's a question, there is an additional question here about legislation to make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
What do we see coming up in legislation?
Well, I think the most important thing, now that energy prices are so high, there is a huge run everywhere in Europe on renewables, at also a very personal level. You know, the rate at which Polish families are now installing rooftop solar is incredible. But legislation should change in terms of permitting. If you want to build an offshore wind facility, permitting in general will take you 6 to 7 years before you... We don't have 6 to 7 years. So if you think in terms of legislation, I would like to sit down with the Swedish government, with the German government, and with a number of other governments, and see how we can speed up permitting at a national and European level. That, I think, is the best contribution legislation can make to this process, because, you know, renewable energy has become so cheap that investors are waiting in line to invest in it. The problem is, can we get all the materials we need, enough turbines, enough solar panels, and especially, can we get enough skilled people to build it and to maintain it? That is a big challenge. Investment is not a challenge, but the challenge we need to address as public authorities is especially permitting. We need to speed up. It shouldn't be 7 years, it should be 7 months. That's the only way we will get enough renewable energy going to attain our climate goals.
In Sweden, we have a discussion about making it worth it for the regions and the municipalities. Last year, 68% of the permits were denied from the municipality or the regional perspective. So we need to make that shift happen quickly.
Well, I don't have a silver bullet here, but sometimes what works, and Denmark is a good example, but we have some of that in the Netherlands as well, is to make local citizens co-owners of a wind farm or of other forms of generating renewable energy. You know, it's money in their pocket, it's much lower energy bills. That's attractive. And of course I know that onshore wind is seen sometimes by people as, oh no, we don't want that. But it's an interesting fact that if you look back into journals of the 17th century in the Netherlands, you had people complaining about all these windmills in the landscape. They were spoiling the landscape. You know, the traditional 17th century windmills. And now we attract tourists to come and look at them.
And you have wonderful painters that portray the windmills too. Let's turn to a question about aviation. Can we really afford to convert biomass from forests into aviation fuels? There are a lot of scientists who say using biomass is unsustainable and a threat to biodiversity and shouldn't be a sustainable finance taxonomy.
Well, you know, I gave you one example of a Swedish project that I think would be very useful in this and almost a no-brainer if you can do it technologically. It seems so logical. But apart from that, I hope and I pray that we do not get into the trenches on biomass in the same way we got into the trenches on nuclear. It's almost become sort of a matter of faith. Yes, biomass, no biomass. And I'm in the middle of this. Because I'm not someone who says biomass is always good, because if you get the wrong biomass, you're destroying nature and you're destroying the potential to capture and store CO2 in the nature-based solutions. But we cannot reach our goals without biomass. We will need good biomass. So those who oppose biomass are saying there is no such thing as good biomass, or they're saying you can never control the legislation if you have good biomass. I dispute that. I think together with countries like Sweden and Finland and others, we can come up with a good definition of what sustainable biomass is. And we will need it in our system. And now, not just the biomass from forests, etc., we will also need to largely expand our production of methane, of biomethane, of biogas as an alternative to fossil fuels from Russia. And also here, this cannot drive out the production of food, but it could be done. Also, a country like Ukraine could be a huge asset for all of us if they are part of this biogas in combination with green hydrogen production, in combination with renewables. I'm just looking forward to that potential. But there is no way we can attain our goals without biomass. If you take that out of the equation, we will never be on the mark with our goals. And I hope everybody is willing to see this and help me to make sure we get the right biomass and not the. I mean, the fact that we had experiences with whole forests being clean cut and then turned into little pallets of wood and then put into a furnace, that is horrible. That is horrible. But to use waste from forests and the part of the trees you can't use as biomass, that's good, because what else would you do with it anyway? So we have to be very precise, and we have to be willing to accept, and we have modern ways of monitoring all of this. You can do remote sensing, you can use modern technology to make sure that it's not being abused, this legislation. And I hope Sweden will be my partner in developing these ideas.
Thank you. There's one more question about aviation. How can we get rid of the ghost flights in Europe?
That's an extremely important question, because we need then to change the. We need both the legislation to change, but also we need more moral behavior from the airline industry, because they are so jealous with their slots that very often they hoard slots if they can. And then they are flying empty planes because the legislation says if you don't use a slot, you lose it. And we need to have a sit down and an honest heart-to-heart with the airline industry. And I started already with Lufthansa because those were the most vocal ones. I sat down with a CEO for a long discussion. I said, this is an unsustainable way of doing business. But it's from two sides. It's the one side is stopping them from hoarding slots, and the other side is not taking away slots if they don't use it for objectively acceptable reasons. But to give you a very concrete, the thing is, you can only get an exception if both flights, the flight going out and the flight coming back, are more or less empty. But if you have an empty flight going out and not so empty going back, then that doesn't count. So there are a number of things we can tweak to look for solutions, but it will also need a change in the mentality of the airline industry to not hoard slots that you don't need.
Indeed. A question here about arts and culture and the role arts and culture play in the transition to a safe future. In the latest IPCC report, scientists are making a very important statement. The lack of arts and culture is one of the main reasons for us not to be further with the whole green transition. What are the initiatives from the EU, besides the collaboration with Judy's Bicycle, to bring arts and culture in play and bring it to the core of the green transition?
Well, I think, you know, it's not just arts and culture. It's, of course, science is extremely important. And to accept scientific evidence and truth is essential if our society is to function, and it's being challenged. But I believe the reason it is being challenged is because we have neglected arts, culture, and the humanities. Because before you can get people to accept scientific evidence, you have to have people have a reflection about the human condition and about their relations with other human beings. And the arts and culture, art lies the truth. Art represents the truth in a way that makes you think about who you are and how you relate to others. Art is the best way. You know, a society cannot flourish, cannot exist if we lose the capacity to look at the world through the eyes of an other. And we live in a day and age, and I'm afraid that the internet has contributed to that, where we love to stay in our bubble and only want to talk to people who see things like we do. And we are losing the art of disagreeing well. And we are losing the capacity to be shocked by art. Art also has to have the possibility to shock, even if you don't agree with that. It has to have the possibility to inspire, to get you to react, to get you to reflect about who you are, how you relate to others. And in our day and age, the loss of critical, and I'm appealing to young people and to their educators here. If you don't help young people to develop the skill of critical thinking, because you want to avoid to confront them with things they don't like, then we will lose a generation. You have to confront people with things they don't agree with or they don't like. And closing ourselves into the bubble of, and I'm afraid many of us here agree too much on many things. We are also a bubble. But we have a responsibility to not ignore the people who fundamentally disagree with our views, but to engage with them. Because what happens if you don't, then you can dispute every fact. Then you get people who think the earth is flat. Then you get people who think that there is no climate crisis. Then you get people who think that the Jews control the world. These are the things that are happening in our society because we have lost the capacity to critical thinking. And the only ones who can bring us back to that are artists, is culture, is film, is theater, is paintings, is literature. That is what we need.
Let's take some questions from the room. We have hands up here on the right section, and I think there's a hand all the way in the back here, the right section here, that was first. Further back, please. It's a grayish beige waving now, yes. That hand has been up for a while. Please stand up and state your name.
Hi, my name is Ylva, and I'm with the Swedish innovation agency Vinnova. Thank you so much, Mr. Timmermans. You'll be happy to hear that we actually have a policy lab going on between the regional and national policymakers around permits for wind farms and other things. But my question is around China and your reflections on the possibility of a climate coalition with China, given the current geopolitical state.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's a fascinating question because with all the confrontation we saw between especially the United States and China over the last couple of years, in Glasgow, they came up with a joint declaration that was far more far-reaching than anybody had anticipated, and that helped us cement an agreement in COP 2026. So essentially what the Chinese are doing is to compartmentalize the subjects. Now, you can only go so far in compartmentalizing the subjects, and I think China needs to be called out on its support for Russia today. We need to be very clear about that. China needs to be called out on their human rights record. It is unacceptable that members of the European Parliament are being boycotted by the Chinese, and we need to be very clear as Europeans. But I still have a constructive discussion with the Chinese on climate issues, on energy transition issues, you know, they have built a gigantic offshore wind park. And so looking at China from this perspective, we have to accept the complications of such a huge country with such a diverse construction. So you have an incredible elaboration, extension of renewable energy resourcing, and at the same time they're digging up more coal. And what we need to do is to help them move away from that coal. They have committed to reducing that. Help them move away from that coal, and at the same time stimulate them to expand their renewable energy, and stimulate them, because what is the stimulus for them to be part of this? They were part of the success in Paris, and they're very proud of that. And they don't want to be seen as the ones undermining everything leading up to the next agreements. But I have to tell you that I'm a bit worried about this year, not just about China, but globally, because I think the shadow of the Ukraine war will be over many things we have to do internationally. And I'm sorry to have to say this, but we have a very, very strong consensus in Europe about all of this, but it's not really a global consensus. And many others, not many support Russia. That's not it. I mean, you saw it in the UN, it's only 4 countries. But many other countries, whilst not supporting Russia, also don't feel compelled to support Europe very much. But it's your problem. It's a European problem. So in that, and then they are saying, okay, so now all these things with refugees are possible that were not possible when people were fleeing, when Aleppo was flattened. Now, the Swedes are the last to feel anyway uncomfortable with that, because Sweden is the big moral leader in all of this, and you should be proud of yourselves. I said it to the ambassador last night. The moral aspect of what Sweden has done, with all the difficulties, will sound through time. Will sound through time into the future. But I just want to make the point that our climate policy is also a global policy, and our perspective on the conflict, on the war that Putin has started in Ukraine, is not necessarily the global perspective. And this will have implications for our global policies, whether it's on food security, whether it's on climate, whether it's on international trade, whether it's on development, etc., etc.
Thank you. I know we have a question to that corner over there about Ecocide, because I've been notified of this in the beginning, that there will be a question from Pella Thiel. So please, Pella, will you stand up?
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, you have earlier spoken very powerfully on the need for a sense of urgency, not just on the climate crisis, but also the larger issue of ecocide, mass damage and destruction of nature. Now, including ecocide as an international crime in the International Criminal Court is actually the first demand of the Youth Task Force towards the Stockholm Plus 50 conference held in Stockholm in a couple of months' time. So my question is, do you agree with the global youth on the need for criminalization of ecocide?
Well, I agree on the background of your question. If we can make it happen, is also a very complicated legal issue. I don't know if you know the British lawyer and incredibly strong proponent of these ideas, Philippe Sands. I don't know if you know Philippe Sands. Yes, well, Philippe Sands, I hope I can say he's a friend of mine, and I am a great admirer of his work. And I want to work with him as closely as possible, even though, frankly, the institutional lawyers at all levels are telling me it's impossible. I want to explore as far as we can go. I'm giving you a very honest answer. I want to explore as far as we can go, because I believe that we need to create much larger public awareness about ecocide, because the public awareness we have on the climate crisis is not yet mirrored in the public awareness we have on ecocide, and both are just as life-threatening to the survival of humanity. So we need to make sure the issue of ecocide is higher on the agenda, and exploring what you're saying might help us get there. This is as far as I can go.
Thank you. And it's interconnected, of course, climate change and ecocide.
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. Ecocide, climate crisis, and pandemics are 3 aspects of exactly the same problem.
And war, unfortunately.
Yes.
We have time for one more question. There's a young gentleman there with his hand up behind the lady with the microphone.
Yes, hello. My name is Marcus, and I'm from the Green and Liberal think tank Forest here in Stockholm. The new EU taxonomy has concluded that certain nuclear and gas investments can be classified as sustainable, considering the emissions from gas, especially methane, and the risks of nuclear, which the war in Ukraine has shown. Do you truly believe that they are sustainable energy sources? Thank you.
Is this the final question? Because it makes me so sad.
Well,
it's a very good question. You are right to ask that question. Now, the thing is that to get from where we are to where we need to be, we will need some transitional energy carriers. And like always in Europe, there's the huge lobby for nuclear from a certain country that needs not to be mentioned. And there is a huge lobby for gas from another, slightly bigger country that also doesn't need to be mentioned. And then, as happens in Europe, it lands into a compromise. Now, it wasn't my idea, let's put it this way. But what we have now is that we have defined what is green. And then we have said, these two can help the transition towards green. Okay. Then the war started and everybody was saying, hey, wait a minute, gas? And you see a rethinking in some countries that are saying, okay, we wanted to move from coal via gas to hydrogen and renewables. Perhaps we should not do that. We want to prolong coal and then move to renewables. But if you want to do that, you can work with me, but then you have to speed up the introduction of renewables substantially, because the net effect cannot be more emissions. So if you want to prolong coal slightly, to avoid having to use natural gas as a transition, you can work with me, as long as you introduce renewables much faster then. And that's why I believe there's going to be a huge, huge demand of green hydrogen, a demand that will warrant a global new production of green hydrogen based on solar and wind. Just imagine areas in Africa that are not arable today. You could generate at very low cost enormous amounts of electricity that you can then store in hydrogen or in ammonia. You could run the world's shipping on ammonia 10 years from now through that at very low cost and at huge win for the environment. So I think I've expanded a bit the answer to your question, but I think that is the reality we face. And the only thing the war has, I think, made us aware of is that we need to make this transition period as short as possible.
Thank you. I'd like to conclude with a question for you to frame a call to action for the people watching here in the audience, and also the people watching online, and maybe especially to the youth in this difficult time and this transition that we really need to speed up. Do you have any words of wisdom to send them off with?
Well, you know, my two youngest kids are now almost 18, almost 16. In the period of the pandemic and everything that came with it, I went from 58 to now almost 61. Those are interchangeable years, more or less. You get a bit older, but if you go like my son from 15 to 18, like my daughter from 13 to 16, these are years that never come back. So. And these are years where you form your social environment. This is not about missing out in school in terms of the lessons you learned. It's missing out the social interaction you need. And my two oldest kids are in the early 30s. They've had so many crises, one after the other, during their young lives, that I believe that my generation should be much, much more aware of the responsibility we have to make fundamental changes now, lest we betray our children and grandchildren. So, first of all, thank you to all the young people for this enormous solidarity during the pandemic. You were not really under threat of dying. I was. But because of your behavior, I'm still here. And many of my generation with me. Thank you. Secondly, keep the pressure on us to stop colonizing your future and to work with you to create the right conditions for this transition to happen very quickly. And thirdly, get organized. I mean, if Greta showed one thing, is that it's much better to get out in the street collectively than to put your opinion on Facebook. I mean, this is now an old guy. I mean, I was young when we invented the wheel and fire came, etc. So, but the one lesson I learned in my youth is you can only get change if you make it uncomfortable for the people in power. And you can only make it uncomfortable for them if you mobilize enough people. And the best thing you can do for people of my generation to not feel uncomfortable is to just shout on social media and to stay in your bubble. The one thing you can do to make us really change our ways is to get collectively organized. And in doing that, to also engage with the young people who are tempted by nationalist language, by xenophobic language, by the rejection of society language. Don't leave them aside. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it doesn't feel well, don't exclude them from the dialogue. Engage with them, because at the end of the day, we will only achieve what we want to achieve if we do it collectively. My hope is with you. My solidarity is also with you. And please, please, pull me by my ear if you think we're not doing enough. I will try and do whatever I can to make things better so that I can look my kids and my grandchildren into their eyes without shame. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.